This video is going to be reading a classic article on how to think about education policy by Sandra Taylor. Also happens to come from Australia, like the Colbatch video. Go check that one out if you haven't seen it. This one is called Critical Policy Analysis, Exploring Context, Texts and Consequences. And it's published in the journal Discourse, Studies in the Cultural Politics of Education, which is a highly influential and well-ranked journal on discourse in education in general, but particularly policy sociology. This article is relatively old at the time of reading. It's currently 2023. It was written in 1997, but it is still so useful as a framework and analysis for thinking about what policy is in a discursive way rather than a technicist way. Introduction. Little attention has been given to research methodology in educational policy literature, and, as Ball 1990 has noted, the field of policy analysis has been dominated by commentary and critique rather than empirical research. It would appear that methodological questions about what so-called data are needed for analysis and how that material is collected have been less important in critical policy work than the theoretical frameworks which are used and the questions which are asked. There is, however, an extensive body of literature in the US dealing with the policy evaluation and implementation studies. Much of this literature is managerialist, technicist, and uncritical in approach, although a more critical literature has emerged in recent years. See, for example, Hawksworth, Delian. In the British context, Halpin and Troiner's edited collection has helped to redress the lack of concern for methodological issues within the field. In this paper, I will review recent developments in methodology in policy analysis, with particular emphasis on the influence of theories of discourse. Examples from recent Australian research will be used to illustrate the application of theories of discourse in education policy analysis, and the paper concludes by suggesting some requirements for education policy research, which is both critical and political. So straight away, Taylor here is setting up the problematic that she's going to discuss, which is how do we analyze discourse, policy? What methodologies do we use to conduct research on education policy, and what has received attention from scholars up until this point, at least in 1997, and what has not? And I do think that her point about how one does discourse analysis or policy analysis using discourse has been methodologically very fuzzy and continues to be so. For example, there's a very good paper by Anderson and Holloway in 2020 that does a literature review of different forms of doing critical discourse analysis on policy, and they find at least 10 different ways. So the problematic Taylor is talking about here, where she's saying, but how do you go about doing this kind of research, and what sorts of conclusions does it let you draw, is still a perennial problem when we're thinking about how to make knowledge about policy and its effects. Taylor continues. Osger has termed the field of inquiry in education policy analysis policy sociology, which she describes as rooted in the social science tradition, historically informed, and drawing on qualitative and illuminative techniques. And this term has been adopted by many policy researchers. For example, Grace in 1987 refers to policy scholarship, while the American literature refers to the policy sciences, a term first used by Laswell in 1949. Troiner, however, rejects any dichotomy between policy sociology and other approaches using a social science perspective, basically because he believes that the former underemphasizes feminist and anti-racist work and fails to produce studies that have what he calls, quote, a strategic edge. Troiner wishes to emphasize the linkages between critical policy analysis and critical social research, and argues that critical social research is interested not only in what is going on and why, but is also concerned with doing something about it. Drawing on David Harvey's work in 1990, Troiner stresses that, quote, critical social research includes an overt political struggle against oppressive social structures, end quote. Taking into account these concerns, my preferred term is critical policy analysis, a term which is also quite widely used in the field, and particularly in Australia. Leaving aside the question of terminology, Codd has argued for some time that, quote, the field of policy analysis has been fraught with argument over its purpose and methods. And they write, quote, a widely accepted view, however, takes policy analysis to be a multidisciplinary field that cuts across existing specializations to employ whatever theoretical or methodological approach is most relevant to the issue or problem under investigation. Just to pause there, this is a really important point for research design and research methods in general. Students will often ask me, shouldn't I use quantitative techniques because they're more rigorous, or shouldn't I use this method because it's better? And exactly this quote from Codd that Taylor is giving us here is a leitmotif and constant refrain that we've also encountered throughout the theories of change in schooling course, which is better for what? That what is a better method can only be judged or evaluated relative to the question it is trying to answer. And that's exactly what Codd is saying here, that you employ whatever theoretical or methodological approach is the most relevant to the issue or problem that you are investigating. So always ask yourself, how does what I'm doing answer the question I'm trying to answer, or help illuminate the issue I'm trying to examine? Taylor continues. Further, in a review of recent qualitative research in policy in the UK, Maguire and Ball comment that, in general, policy studies appear to be methodologically unsophisticated, with issues of language and meaning taken for granted. Elsewhere, writing of his aim to capture the messiness and complexity of the policy-making process in his research on the 1988 Education Reform Act in Britain, Ball comments that, quote, the changing processes of policymaking in education over the past 10 years have, to a great extent, outrun the development of relevant analysis and conceptualization, and the conceptual tools seem blunt and irrelevant, end quote. Gillian Fulcher made a similar point in relation to her research on integration policies in Victoria. Fulcher writes of her search for a theoretical model in the policy literature to use in her research, and her surprise in finding the inadequacy of most of that literature, and that most of it conveyed, quote, no sense of the political struggles involved in developing and implementing policy, end quote. As Fulcher put it, quote, the discrepancy between the literature and the political reality I saw encouraged me to be skeptical of most of the conceptual and theoretical platforms that the literature offered, end quote. So let's just pause here. And remember, Taylor is writing in 1997. But there's some useful history to think about here that she's reflecting back to us regarding how technicist approaches to policy have, for about 40 years up until this point, sort of from the 1960s up into the 1990s, not really accurately reflected the politics in policy, as if policy and politics could somehow be separated from each other, which of course they can't, not at all. Policy is politics. But at least the methods and forms of analysis that scholars and practitioners alike have been using have somehow kind of wanted to treat the politics in policy as an inconvenient error to be ignored or erased out, rather than integral to what policy is. And it's useful to remember that, because despite this having been recognized in the 80s and 90s by Codd, Osger, Ball, and others, there is still this desire to treat policy in this way, even now in the as we ended the first quarter of the 21st century, that there is still this idea that somehow one can take the politics out of policy and find the, quote, correct answer using technical methods. Let's read on from Taylor. There was, it seems, some sort of impasse in theory and methodology which was recognized by these writers. However, recent theoretical developments have been useful in highlighting the complexities of policymaking for which the traditional models seemed simplistic, and old conceptual tools seemed too blunt. They have offered, quote, a new set of tools to begin to try to explain things, end quote. That's from a key text by Stephen Ball in 1990, with new possibilities being opened up through associated methodologies. This has led to a growing awareness of methodological issues in education policy work, with an increasing emphasis on issues to do with meaning, and, related, a shift towards exploring the effects of policy rather than on policy intentions. We are also becoming much more conscious of questions of subjectivity and interpretation, particularly in interview-based studies, and of the standpoint of the researcher. Remember that interpretation was Kolbach's focus. In general, the problematizing of aspects of method in this way seems to be a result of postmodernism, quote, as a growing intellectual and cultural sensibility, according to Schramm, that is influencing academic thought, as well as, and often related, the impact of feminist approaches to policy analysis. Moving away from these broader developments, I now want to turn to consider the particular influence of theories of discourse on policy analysis and their value for critical policy work. So now Taylor is going to take us into what discourse is and how it relates to doing critical policy analysis. Theories of discourse and policy. While there are various strands within this work, and a number of theorists have been influential in policy analysis, all draw to some extent on Foucault's theories of discourse, often complemented by neo-Marxist cultural theorists like Gramsci, for example, Norman Fairclough's work in 1989 or Jane Kenway's work in 1990. While Thompson, 1984, provides a detailed discussion of the various strands contributing to discourse theory, it's Codd's work in 1988 which provides a clear discussion of the theoretical underpinnings to his application of discourse theory to education policy analysis. My own approach has been influenced more indirectly by my work in feminist cultural studies and in feminist policy studies. By using the term theories of discourse, I want to adopt a broad and pragmatic approach to the interrelated developments in social theory, and reject any tight categorization of theoretical positions, as has been common in much of the recent academic literature. So what Taylor is gesturing to here is that she wants to be pragmatic and keep herself open to noticing how different aspects of social theory are developing, and not lock herself into a particular camp, which then means that she cannot maneuver according to what she thinks needs to be done. She continues, central in theories of discourse are language and meaning, aspects which, as has been mentioned, have often been taken for granted in policy analysis in the past. The major explanatory concept used in these theories is discourse. This term was used by Foucault, quote, to designate the conjunction of power and knowledge, end quote, while Mützenfeld defines discourse as, quote, the complex of notions, categories, ways of thinking, and ways of communicating that constitutes power-infused system of knowledge. Mützenfeld uses the concept in developing a sociological framework to examine how political processes and policymaking shape and are shaped by both social power relations and the power of the state. This approach is particularly useful for critical policy analysis because it can take account of policymaking at all levels, allows for conceptualization of the state, and highlights the political nature of policymaking. In addition, it is a dynamic framework which emphasizes culture as well as practice. So just to notice here that the word practice gets used by different scholars in different ways. And this is something that can be quite tricky about academic reading, is to familiarize yourself with the different ways that different words can be used. The word discourse as well is sometimes used to refer to language, just the way people talk. the way that discourse was used by Kolbach, for example, is to refer to sort of different logics and registers of speaking. Discourse, however, in a Foucauldian sense, can also be something much deeper. And it's what is sayable and what is possible to be said and what is unsayable is that what defines a discourse. So we'll unpack that more in class, how the word discourse can take on multiple meanings, and also how the word practice can take on multiple meanings. But right here, the way that Taylor is using the word practice is she's talking about activity. She's talking about what people do. Whereas a practice theory approach would say, well, practice is not just what people do, but also the culture in which they do it and also the systems that they build for doing it. So just to flag that up for you, you don't need to be completely well versed in all the different ways that these words get used, but you will find at times as you read that different authors coming from different theoretical traditions use these words differently. Even though policy is not explicitly mentioned in the extract which follows, it can be usefully conceptualized within this framework. From Ritzenfeld in 92, quote, on one hand, the various projects of state institutions, party politics, and social movements draw on the social categories, resources, and meanings, that is, discourses, that are made available and reproduced through the culture and practices of the wider society. On the other hand, those same political projects simultaneously impact upon the wider society. They shape social categories, position people within them, and mold the categories of citizenship through which people are brought into particular relationships with the state and politics. Policy, as an aspect of the various political projects of state institutions referred to by Ritzenfeld, is central in these dynamics. Fairclough's focus on language as social practice also provides a useful theoretical base for critical policy analysis. Fairclough is interested specifically in the relationship between, quote, discursive practices, events, and texts on the one hand, and, quote, wider social and cultural structures, relationships, and processes on the other, in order to explore the linkages between discourse, ideology, and power. These linkages are clearly relevant to the exploration of policy documents within broader policy processes. In my view, discourse theories have enhanced the scope of critical policy analysis in a number of ways. The most obvious influence is in the increasing focus on policy documents as texts. But discourse theories can also be drawn on to explore policy-making processes within the broad discursive field within which policies are developed and implemented. In other words, they enable valuable fine-grained analyses to be undertaken with a broader structural analysis. I have found them useful in my own ongoing work on equity, policy, and the politics of change, particularly because of their emphasis on culture. And in Figure 1, we have a conceptual idea about policy as struggle, where you get different logics or discourses coming into the arena of struggle, which may have competing or divergent objectives. Side note, personally, I don't find these kinds of graphical representations of this nature particularly useful. I don't feel like this particular figure explains anything that the text hasn't already explained. But I guess for some people it might make sense, particularly if you are someone who likes to sort of sketch and draw things. But in general, I think that one must use a diagram for illustrating that which is difficult to convey in the text and which complements the text, which I'm not entirely sure this one does. But here we go. Taylor continues, and perhaps that Figure 1 will make more sense. She says, from a discourse theory perspective, policy making is viewed as an arena of struggle over meaning, or as the politics of discourse from Anna Yateman. The emphasis is placed on policy processes, and policy seen as a, quote, struggle between contenders of competing objectives, where language, or more specifically discourse, is used tactically, end quote. For example, in her study of the development and implementation of integration policy in Victoria, Fulcher found that the so-called rights discourse articulated by parents of students with disabilities conflicted with the discourse of professionalism of the special educators. Struggles such as these are viewed as occurring at all levels and in all arenas of policy making. Fulcher identified policy arenas at 6 different levels in the Victorian education system, from school council subcommittees on integration to the regional board, and are often reflected in the form of tensions and contradictions or competing discourses in the resulting policies themselves. From this perspective, then, policy texts represent the outcome of political struggles over meaning. This is a really important idea. Policy texts represent the outcome of political struggles over meaning. Codd elaborates on this point, and they say, quote, policy documents can be said to constitute the official discourse of the state. Thus, policies produced by and for the state are obvious instances in which language serves a political purpose, constructing particular meanings and signs that work to mask social conflict and foster commitment to the notion of universal public interest. In this way, policy documents produce real social effects through the production and maintenance of consent. Right, let's just unpack a couple of things in this quote which are really important. For example, the idea of a universal public interest is a really important myth that any ruling group must weave and spin and sell to the people they rule. They need to maintain some impression that there is such a thing as the universal public interest, and that the actions that they are taking, whether they're a king or a demagogue or a democratically government or just the committee of parents at a high school, you need to A, construct this thing called this is in all of our interests, and B, be seen to be pursuing or taking decisions in favor of those interests. Because if you don't, you are unable to maintain the consent of people that you are making decisions on behalf of. And if you do the leadership and change course in the spring term, we talk about this a lot. The idea that power and decision-making authority and legitimacy to make decisions on behalf of other people is always a tentative and fragile, temporary compact with the people that you are deciding for, and they can take it away at any time. So you have to maintain their consent to be governed, ruled, or led. Which is quite contrary to most way that we think about leadership, which is that the leader commands fealty or loyalty from those they lead. No, the leader coerces and cajoles consent out of the led, and needs to keep doing so in order to maintain their position of power. Let's continue with Taylor. However, central to theories of discourse is the idea that there is no single reading of policy texts. Rather, for any text, a plurality of readers must necessarily produce a plurality of readings, according to Codd. Consequently, Codd suggests that, quote, instead of searching for authorial intentions, perhaps the proper task of policy analysis is to examine the differing effects that documents have in the production of meaning by readers. So what you're trying to do is create a text where different readers will produce different understandings, preferably understandings that they like, which is why they consent to the document. Through reinterpretation and recreation, policies may be seen to be, quote, continuously constituted and reconstituted through discussion, activities, and social relationships. Further, it is possible to conceptualize policy making as a continuous policy cycle of policy making and remaking in specific sites. Associated with this theoretical approach is some sort of textual analysis, ideology critique, or deconstruction to highlight the constitutive practices texts use. So the texts are actually doing work, they are making meaning, They are making meaning in the eyes and minds of the people reading them, and the people writing them intend them to do so in different ways and to differing degrees of success. The approach is useful in highlighting values and teasing out competing discourses. That's textual analysis, by the way, the approach of textual analysis. It's useful in highlighting values, teasing out competing discourses, both in policy development and policy implementation, to use the old dichotomy. This old dichotomy is this, as if we can split out development and implementation as two separate processes, which has subsequently been heavily critiqued and questioned. Some fine-grained analyses of the use of language in policy texts use a linguistic approach, exploring linguistic strategies used to position readers, as well as key words used. However, McCool, in what seems to be one of the first applications of discourse analysis in relation to education policy in 1984, distances himself from what he refers to as, quote, a narrowly formalistic look at the linguistics of policy statements, end quote. He explains that policy texts, quote, constitute nodal points or networks of signifying practice generally, networks of discourse which constitute a field of power and knowledge. So what McCool here is saying is that you can't just look at the text of one policy. You need to see how policies linked up together and create these kind of networks of meaning. His focus is on texts and textuality, on the conditions of possibility of policy texts and how they come to be. McCool analysed Queensland Education Department's Equal Opportunities Policy Statement and associated documents produced by the Conservative Bjelke-Petersen government in 1981, developed as a result of the availability of Commonwealth funding for programmes for the education of girls. McCool showed, using a discourse analytic approach, the contradictions within the policy documents and how the policy text transformed, incorporated, and neutralised feminist discourses. Significantly, this discourse analysis was placed in a broader socio-historical context, as is emphasised by Codd, whose application of discourse analysis to education policy work has been influential in Australia and New Zealand. Such fine-grained analyses need to be placed in a broader context. Quote, policy documents are ideological texts that have been constructed within a particular context. The task of deconstruction begins with the recognition of that context. End quote. The following section, which briefly outlines some of the ways in which discourse theory can be used in critical policy analysis, begins with a consideration of the analysis of policy contexts. And you might recall that the title of this paper was Contexts, Texts, and Consequences. So Taylor continues. Applications in education policy analysis. Discourse theory can be used to explore particular policies in their historical context, tracing how policy so-called problems are constructed and defined, and how particular issues get to be on the policy agenda. Here you actually see that Taylor is beating Carol Bucci to the goal. Carol Bucci wrote about how is the problem defined in 2009, and Taylor is writing about how policy problems are constructed, defined, and put on the agenda about 12 years before that. It is also useful in highlighting how policies come to be framed in certain ways, reflecting how economic, social, political, and cultural contexts shape both the content and language of policy documents. For example, there have been significant changes in how approaches to educational inequality have been framed, and in key concepts which have been used in education policies. Differences in terminology reflect the particular historical and cultural context, and have implications for the ways in which particular concepts are used and understood. The various concepts which are associated with equity issues are highly malleable, with terms and meanings changing over time and according to the particular political context. For example, Michael Apple wrote, quote, concepts do not remain still for very long. They have wings, so to speak, and can be induced to fly from place to place. It is this context which defines their meaning, end quote. In Britain, those stronger policy approaches which are directed at structural change have been termed anti-racist and or anti-sexist. The term equal opportunities is used to cover the general policy field. But in Australia, on the other hand, the terms equity and social justice have come to be used as the umbrella terms to refer to policies which aim to address inequalities in education, reflecting a move towards the notion of, quote, fairness, which places emphasis on participation as well as outcomes in addressing educational inequalities between social groups. So what Taylor is showing us here is how in different contexts and different moments, different places will use different terminology to refer to similar concepts, but there are important subtleties in between them. So the term anti-racist has come back again, but now it's far stronger in the US in the 2023 when I'm reading this. However, social justice is now incredibly well used in the UK. And there are other connections as well, for example, in other Anglophone Commonwealth countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, Canada, etc. It's also interesting to notice what Apple was saying about concepts flying from place to place and how globalization and the internationalization of higher education has speeded up the rate at which terms are developed in one part of the world and then picked up and used in another. Taylor continues, hence linguistic practices used, which operate at the level of the metaphor and symbolism, are relevant for policy making and analysis. Policy discourse can be conceptualized as a kind of symbolic language with specific terms, such as equity, acting as condensation symbols within the cultural context. And as Stuart Hall, I'm going to add my own comment here, as Stuart Hall would say, specific terms like equity are not just condensation symbols, but they're also what Hall called floating signifiers. They're vague enough for people to fill them with the meaning that they prefer. One person's idea of equity is not the same as another. It's that vagueness that allows different readers of a policy text to consent to the text, believing that the text says what they want it to say, when meanwhile, what the meaning they're making out of that text is as much a function of their own way that they fill words with meaning as it is actually what the text says. Taylor continues, the significance of the cultural context for education policy making was highlighted in my research on equity and the Education Reform Act in Britain. I explored the impact of the changing cultural and political context on the, quote, politics of discourse relating to, quote, equal opportunities policies in Britain. And I argued that, quote, the British experience shows the importance of the cultural or, quote, common sense level in influencing how popular prejudices are taken up and articulated in policies. The Conservatives were able to draw on the deep-seated conservatism in British culture to marginalise anti-sexist and anti-racist education and to construct their new policy agenda, end quote. In addition, the conservative popular press were able to pick up and articulate discourses of racism in the community in orchestrating support for the government, and in the process, quote, equal opportunities became seen as a, quote, loony left issue and discredited. See Wallace 93 on the contribution of the mass media on education policy processes. This is still happening. If you go and read any of the media in the UK today, this term loony left is still popular in conservative press to marginalise or make absurd or make ridiculous certain ideas around, say, anti-racist, redress, anti-colonialist ideas that are not in keeping with a certain conservative agenda that wishes to preserve the status quo of power relations in society. If anything, it's become more the case as media has become more extreme and trying to compete with social media for revenue through clicks and driving traffic online. I'm doing some research at the moment about how this also happens in the South African case, the way that policies are articulated through the discourses that the media produces and reproduces. And often these have the effect of amplifying minoritarian conservative views that are in the way that Gramsci pointed out when he analyzed the way that meaning-making reproduces advantage and class. These are often the views of the middle classes who wish to hold on to disproportionate levels of social power. So the media often is quite distorted by a middle-class readership. Let's keep reading what Taylor has to say. In contrast, my research with Miriam Henry, the emphasis was more on the impact of the changing economic and political context on the way equity issues have been framed or reframed in Australian education policy. Labor's approach to gender reform policy was to link together gender equity and economic rationalism in an uneasy alliance as a result of Labor's shift towards economic rationalism in the mid to late 1980s. This is Labor in Australia, by the way, not Labor in the United Kingdom. And you can tell by the spelling. The Australians use the American spelling of Labour. However, Taylor continues, we argued that this approach to social justice builds on Australian traditions of reform in which elements of market needs and social reform are intertwined. So here we are tangling up a form of free market economic logic with a social reform logic of addressing intergroup inequalities. They continue, we traced the impact of this contradictory policy context on the implementation of the national policy for the education of girls. As a result of the competing discourses, with economic rationalist discourses dominating, the equity goals of the policy were distorted through a narrowing focus on vocational education and training. As well as being useful in exploration of policy contexts, then, discourse theory can be applied to policy implementation case studies too. Given that contradictory contexts and competing interests are reflected in policies as competing discourses, policy effects are by no means certain or predictable. Discourse theories are useful for investigating how policies are read and used in context. In other words, for documenting the politics of discourse during policy implementation. This kind of focus will be illustrated in more detail in the next section. Discourse theory can also be used to highlight the workings of the state in policy formulation. For example, see Ball's research in 1990 on the development of the Education Reform Act, or Jane Kenway's work in 1992 on the work of feminism in the state. My own work on the state and social change has been influenced by discourse theory via feminism. We have drawn on feminist accounts of the state, which, in line with a focus on the politics of policy processes, emphasize the state as a set of dynamic, historically located, and complex processes, rather than simply a set of institutions. In Burton's words, quote, the state is not a thing. It does not exist as a single monolithic entity. It is a complex of relationships, embodying a certain form of power operating through various institutional arrangements. The state is a social political process, the result at any given moment of struggles and demands. End quote. The influence of theories of discourse have resulted in more critical awareness of methodological questions which had previously been taken for granted, particularly in relation to interpretation. In their policy case studies of the Participation and Equity Programme in Victorian schools, Fazal Rizvi and Stephen Keymis in 1987 refer to a scene in, quote, The Life of Brian, which is a Monty Python skit, by the way, to illustrate the problem of implementation. Life of Brian is a parody skit done by Monty Python in the 1970s to refer to a figure who is positioned as a Jesus or Christ-like figure, but with the absurdity of the politics around this radical pro-social justice figure, who then is A, not taken seriously, and B, ends up being murdered for his beliefs by accident, just as all the people who were following him allow him to be killed. So from Life of Brian, quote, in the film there is a moment when a spectator of the Sermon on the Mount relays the words of the distant Christ to others still further back in the crowd. He says, blessed are the cheesemakers. The interpretation of interpretation causes problems of refraction as messages are relayed across distance, across time, levels of hierarchy, and locations. So the Christ figure in the movie says, "Blessed are the peacemakers," but by the time it reaches the back of the crowd, it's been broken telephone, and the guy says he's saying, "Blessed are the cheesemakers." And this is not an uncommon problem in policy as well, as it refracts through different layers of government apparatus down to people who must make things happen. Taylor continues, these problems clearly have implications for policymaking processes. They also have implications for methodology in critical policy analysis itself, as new questions are posed about the validity of ethnographic and other qualitative methodologies which are often used in policy work. Questions have also been raised about the ideological nature of policy research, and we have come to see the ways in which our theoretical frameworks help to legitimate particular approaches to policymaking. For example, Ball in 1990, researching for changes in education policymaking processes in Britain following the Education Reform Act, suggested that perhaps theoretical shifts have made the pluralist approach to policymaking seem to be inadequate and ideological. In this context, research by Gewirtz and Osgood demonstrated that the notion of partnership in Britain had been working in an ideological way, obscuring the bureaucratic control exerted on education policy making at the local level by central government officers. There have also been a recent tendency to problematize how policy problems are constructed and how they are framed. For example, see Beilhardt, Huxley, Yateman, Griffin. In this context, Schramm shows how social welfare policy in contemporary post-industrial United States maintains old distinctions and helps to recreate problems of the past, especially in relation to reproducing women's poverty, and argues that policy helps to construct the reality it confronts. And this is, just to say here, this is a very discourse-centric way of thinking. That instead of addressing the reality, policy actually speaks the reality into existence. Schirach, on the other hand, advocates an emphasis in policy analysis on how problems get to be on the policy agenda, and gives this approach the new name of policy archaeology. Research on the new post-compulsory education and training agenda. In this section of the paper, I will discuss two examples from my research with Miriam Henry on the new post-compulsory education and training policies in Australia, in which our work has been influenced by theories of discourse. Our ongoing interest is on equity, policy, and the politics of change. Debates around the post-compulsory education and training agenda. Our initial research project on the post-compulsory policies focused on the policy context and the debates around the new agenda. In terms of the applications to policy analysis discussed in the previous section, the project attempted to link text with context. We traced the framing of the policy agenda, resulting from the involvement of the Commonwealth and all state governments, the Australian Council of Trade Unions and the unions, and business and industry, and the way competing discourses were stitched together in the new policies. We also traced the historical antecedents which led to this policy framework. For example, both the government's and the ACTU's agendas build on a mix of utilitarian and more progressive discourses in Australian education, the origins of which we traced and documented. The various competing interests and discourses involved in policy formulation were explored through an analysis of the media debates in the Australian newspaper's weekly Higher Education supplement through 1992, in the year the policies were developed. The main debates were over the following issues: the distinction between education and training, and the respective roles of the university and the TAFE colleges, competency-based education and training, centralised policy control, and funding and resources. We argued that our analysis of debates revealed new alliances and divisions involving key players and sectors of the post-compulsory system, and highlighted, quote, the stretched nature of this policy umbrella, sheltering as it does a fragile consensus, in turn sheltering a number of disparate and not necessarily compatible interests, end quote. It was clear that there were underlying tensions within the new vocationalist discourses in the Finn, Carmichael and Mayer reports reflecting these disparate interests. For example, between exponents of liberal education and vocational training, or between Ford and post-Fordist assumptions about the workplace. Despite the use of key words such as pathways and convergence, which acted as a sense as linguistic markers glossing over the different perspectives of key players. For example, quote, the competencies debate was complicated by the different strands of competencies involved. Competency-based training or education, vocational competencies as referred to in the Carmichael report, and the key competencies as developed by the Mayer Committee. The proponents of the new policies argued that the key competencies form the foundation for, but are independent of, the Australian Vocational Certificate training system. A crucial point because in much of the education debate, the various competency strands were conflated by those, such as the older, more traditional universities, who opposed the agenda. We argued that the agenda was complex and ambiguous, operating in a multi-layered policy field and offering contradictory policies for young people. We suggested that, while limited reforms were possible, the very breadth and depth and ambiguity of the policy agenda the very breadth and ambiguity of the policy agenda might very well exacerbate regressive ends. So just to notice something here, when referring to things like the Carmichael report or the Mayer Committee, what you'll often find is that before a policy is enacted or drafted, that the government will often employ these committees of inquiry or expert panels headed up by somebody whose name then ends up on the report to do some research and make recommendations. And these are often called committees of inquiry or some kind of, sort of presidential report or government report on a particular issue. And they often take the name of the head of the committee appointed. So the Carmichael report, the Mayer Committee, this is not an uncommon way of performing, to use Ashworth's term, performing legitimate policy making through taking knowledge production seriously. If you appear to be serious about building your policy on credible expert knowledge, then you appoint these committees to build that knowledge prior to the actual policy being drafted. The implementation of the Carmichael report. Following the initial project, we were then interested in the impact of this contradictory and ambiguous agenda. In 1993, we commenced research in Queensland aimed at investigating which aspects of the new policies were being picked up on the ground. And here the focus of our research was on the relation between texts and consequences. We were interested in examining the broad claim for greater, quote, inclusiveness, as well as more targeted notions of equity, underlying the concern with questions of participation, equity, and access for disadvantaged groups in the Carmichael report, and associated documentation. We looked in some detail at 4 of the reports funded as pilot studies for the introduction of the AVC training system, also referred to as the AVC pilots, which in turn involved an examination of the processes surrounding the administration of these pilots. Given our theoretical interest in the dynamics and politics of policy processes, we wanted to explore the administrative and systemic context within which the pilots operated, as well as on-the-ground implementation issues. Hence, we also examined how equity matters were dealt with within the Commonwealth and state bureaucracies, as well as within the projects themselves. Key players involved in initiating or implementing the pilots were interviewed, and documentation relating to the pilots was examined. Here, pilots means pilot projects. Additionally, we had access to the minutes of state steering committee meetings. The documents revealed that there is no shortage of rhetoric or strategies for dealing with equity. And our study confirms that there is also no shortage of subversive tactics on the ground either. The research highlighted an important dynamic in the change process, the relationship between policy objectives and policy outcomes. The study indicated that slippages between rhetoric and practice were already apparent in the early implementation stages of these policies and threatened to push the policy agenda in conservative directions. The mediating effects of a complex layering of policy processes, usefully captured by the notion of policy refraction, was notable in this case study. Strongly stated equity objectives at the Commonwealth level became progressively weakened in the ebb and flow of negotiation and in the face of local pressures along the policy chain. Policy chain is kind of all the different people involved in making a policy happen. The perceived urgency of getting the agenda, quote, up and running, the constitution of a state steering committee without expertise in or commitment to equity implementation, the masculinist culture of the trades environment, the particular pressure facing schools, and so on. The study showed how the various levels, Commonwealth, state, and local, were able to play off against each other in order to avoid responsibility for equity provision. But slippage between objectives and outcomes is not simply a matter of a gap between policy formulation, or the rhetoric, and implementation, or the reality. The notion of competing discourses is also relevant to this analysis. The case study showed how, in the politics of policy implementation, older and powerful meanings may emerge within the new vocationalist discourse. The pilot projects used keywords such as pathways, equity, and convergence to legitimate fairly traditional versions of vocational education, likely to maintain rather than address social divisions. Also embedded in the policies were other competing discourses of regulation and deregulation, the latter a reflection of the economic context which threatened to distort the long-term goals of the policies. We used the notion of, quote, playing the agenda in relation to the dynamics of policymaking at all levels, highlighting the politics of discourse where new concepts were used strategically to legitimate particular approaches and to attract funds from the AVC bucket for projects which failed to come to grips with new policies. This is a really important part here as well. Jonathan Jansen wrote some very important stuff in 2002 about how policies are always trying to play to the gallery where the money comes from, because an unfunded policy is simply a symbolic policy. Taylor continues, conclusion, linking contexts, texts, and consequences. In this concluding section, I will attempt to draw the threads of my argument together and suggest some criteria for approaching education policy research, which is both critical and political. In the paper, I have examined the influence of theories of discourse on policy analysis and their value for critical policy work. I have discussed a few examples of their application from my own recent research, though these examples are not offered in any way as the ideal models. Rather than indicating a deliberate move to draw on discourse theory, the research has been more indirectly influenced by discourse theory through feminist cultural studies and feminist policy analysis. I have argued that discourse theory has allowed us to address the complexity of education policy making through a focus on the politics of discourse. In my view, such an approach is able to contribute to a deeper understanding of how policy-making processes work at a fine-grained level. However, to be strategically and politically useful, it is important that such fine-grained analyses are located within a broader context, including an historical context. This seems to be a crucial feature of critical policy analysis. That is, the notion of thinking relationally, where theoretical frameworks are used to place cultural forms within broad patterns of social inequality and relations of domination. Similarly, Agger usefully distinguishes between a critical or sociologically based post-structuralism, where discursive strategies of policy texts are placed in broad context, and a post-structuralism drawn more from a literary criticism, which does not take account of the broader political context within which texts are generated. So she's referring there to post-structuralism being used in two different ways, in a sociological way and drawing from literary studies in media and English, etc., cultural studies. She continues, there seems to be a general agreement amongst most policy researchers that there is a need to take account of both micro and macro levels, and that critical work needs to place education policymaking within its broad economic, social, and historical context. But rather than maintain the macro-micro dichotomy, or even a macro-meso-micro categorization, I would want to emphasize the many-layered nature of policymaking and the importance of exploring the linkages between the various levels of the policy process, with an emphasis on highlighting power relations. This is really important because discourse at the end of the day is power as enacted through who gets to shape meaning making. In other words, we need to think about three aspects included in my title: contexts, texts, and consequences. Policy texts need to be analysed within their context and also in relation to their impact on policy arenas in the broadest sense. There is probably a need, too, for more comparative work, as advocated by Roger Dale. I have been struck by the ways in which the political context within which we work frame our approaches to policy analysis. In Britain, as a result of changes brought about by the Education Reform Act and the marginalisation of sociology as a discipline, policy researchers have probably had fewer opportunities to be involved with policy development than in Australia. Labour governments in Australia have provided opportunities for direct involvement in central policymaking at Commonwealth and state levels, and there are also opportunities through the unions, women's movement and other community groups to become involved in policy processes more indirectly. For example, our research on women and training has been used by activists within the unions to push the training reform agenda in progressive ways. As Finch observes, quote, "One important implication of policy-oriented qualitative research is that it has the potential for engaging the researched as well as the researcher in evaluating the status quo and bringing about change." End quote. Thus, she reminds us of the need to be concerned about grassroots policy change, as well as providing information upwards to remote policy makers. In this paper, I have avoided becoming involved in the state control versus policy cycle debate, which has become artificially polarized and reified in the literature in ways that are not very useful. This so-called debate is a tangled web with a number of strands or dimensions caught up in the discussions. As well as the issue of the role of the state versus localized players in specific sites, in the development and implementation of policy cycle, there are vestiges of old debates around pluralism versus state control, policymaking as linear versus complex, and the degree to which an analysis is sufficiently strategic or not. There have also been vigorous debates in the literature around the use of post-structuralist approaches in theorizing policy, which are relevant to the present discussion. Criticisms have been made of the use of discourse theory in policy analysis for underplaying the constraints on policymaking, and Hatcher and Troiner argue that the policy cycle approach, quote, "distorts understandings of the policy process, especially in relative powers which it assigns to the central apparatus of the state and to schools," end quote. Other writers criticize post-structuralist approaches for their failure to ground fine-grained analysis in a material or structural analysis. In this, I have emphasized the importance of placing fine-grained policy analyses in their broader context. In his recent work, which draws on critical theory and ethnography, as well as post-structuralism, Ball makes it clear that he is not neglecting broader power issues, or indeed political questions relating to social justice. Further, he anticipates criticism of his use of what might be seen as incompatible theoretical perspectives, arguing that, quote, "the critical analyst must take risks, use imagination, but also be reflexive. The concern is with the task, rather than with theoretical purism or conceptual niceties." This is the position which I have adopted in this paper, though I, too, am aware of the possible problems of eclecticism. And finally, I think that methodological issues have been sidestepped for too long in education policy analyses. More attention should be given to questions of meaning and interpretation, as well as validity, reliability, and subjectivity, which I have only mentioned briefly. Such attention will strengthen policy research and hopefully produce critical analyses, which will be useful in relation to the pursuit of social justice. What is important is an underlying value commitment to social justice and an analysis which is as rigorous as possible. And we need to remember, in line with the broader conceptualization of policy as the politics of discourse, which I have advocated, that policy research may not only be used by policymakers within the state, but by other interest groups, such as teachers. An understanding of policy processes as the politics of discourse can be very useful to those involved in on-the-ground struggles in the various arenas of education policy making. There's much in here to discuss, which we'll pick up in class and in the reading support session. But that is the end of Sandra Taylor's text, Context, Texts and Consequences, where she thinks about policy analysis through the lens of thinking about discourse.